Chemistry Department at WJ, but I'm also the Vice President of our Phi Beta Kappa chapter. So I'm going to introduce our speaker. I teach in this room, and I'm used to speaking loudly in it, so can everyone hear me okay if I do not use the mic? Okay. All right. I am going to read my remarks so that I don't mess up what I want to tell you. But I do welcome you to this evening. And again, this is the Phi Beta Kappa Visiting Scholar Program, so I'll just tell you a little bit about Phi Beta Kappa. Founded in 1776, the Phi Beta Kappa Society is the nation's most prestigious academic honor society. It has chapters at 286 colleges and universities and more than 500,000 members throughout the country. Its mission is to champion education in the liberal arts and sciences, to recognize academic excellence, and to foster freedom of thought and expression. Since 1956, the Phi Beta Kappa Society's Visiting Scholar Program has been offering undergraduates the opportunity to spend time with some of America's most distinguished scholars. The purpose of the program is to contribute to the intellectual life of the institution by making possible an exchange of ideas between the visiting scholar and the resident faculty and students. It is my great pleasure tonight to introduce Washington and Jefferson College's 2017 Phi Beta Kappa Visiting Scholar, Dr. Bart Ehrman. Dr. Ehrman, who received his undergraduate degree from Wheaton College and his master's in divinity and PhD degrees from Princeton Theological Seminary, is the James A. Gray Distinguished Professor of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which happens to be my alma mater, as my students know, during basketball season. And he has taught at Chapel Hill since 1988. Professor Ehrman has published extensively in the fields of New Testament and early Christianity, having written or edited 30 books, including 5 New York Times bestsellers, Misquoting Jesus, God's Problem, How the Bible Fails to Answer Our Most Important Question, Why We Suffer, Jesus Interrupted, Forged, Why the Bible's Authors Are Not Who We Think They Are, and How Jesus Became God. He's also recorded 8 lecture courses for the Great Courses. More than 2 million copies of his books and courses have been sold, and his books have been translated into 27 languages. Professor Ehrman's work has been featured in Time, Newsweek, The New Yorker, The Washington Post, and other print media. And he has appeared on NBC's Dateline, CNN, the History Channel, National Geographic, the Discovery Channel, the BBC, major NPR shows, The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, the Colbert Report, and other top media outlets. That's quite a diverse range of shows. Winner of numerous university awards and grants, Professor Ehrman is a recipient of the 2009 J.W. Pope Spirit of Inquiry Teaching Award, the 1993 UNC Undergraduate Student Teaching Award, the 1994 Philip and Ruth Heddleman Prize for Artistic and Scholarly Achievement, and the Bowman and Gordon Gray Award for Excellence in Teaching. We are delighted to have Dr. Ehrman on the WJ campus. Earlier today, he visited a religious studies class, and I saw students exiting that class and heard a good review immediately as they were leaving the class. Tomorrow, he will conduct a seminar for philosophy and religious studies students, and he will have lunch with students where conversation will focus on faith journey. Tonight, Professor Ehrman will deliver his public lecture. You can see the title here. I do want to note that following the talk, there will be a public reception in the atrium of Swanson Science Building, which is essentially right beside, or right across the little walkway from this building, and everyone is welcome to attend that. Also, tomorrow morning, between 9:30 and 11 o'clock, Professor Ehrman will hold open office hours in that same building in room 300C. So WJ students and faculty are welcome to stop by during that time, meet and converse with Professor Ehrman. Finally, I want to extend my thanks to our local Phi Beta Kappa chapter, the WJ Office of Academic Affairs, and the National Endowment for the Humanities for supporting Dr. Ehrman's visit to WJ. So I will turn it over to our distinguished speaker. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Is this microphone working?
Yeah.
Is it working in the back okay? Yeah, great. Okay, good. Yeah, well, thank you very much. Thank you for coming. I've never been here before, so it's a real pleasure. And I'm looking forward to snow.
I may be here for a lot longer. We'll see. I teach at Chapel Hill, as Mark was saying, and it's a great place to teach. I've been there for a long time now. I'm teaching my class on the New Testament this semester. This is my introduction to the New Testament. I have about 150 students, so it's a different environment. We have large classes for our introductory classes at Chapel Hill. I began my class this semester at Chapel Hill on the New Testament the way I begin my classes normally in the New Testament, which is the first day of class, students come in and I send around my syllabus and explain to them what the course is going to be. And I try to get them to see the approach we're going to take in the class. Because the approach we take in the class in a secular research university like the University of North Carolina is very different from the approach that my students are accustomed to. This is a class on the New Testament, and my students tend to be Christian kids from North Carolina. This is the Bible Belt, and they you might wonder, why are they taking a class on the New Testament? Well, I mean, it fulfills a requirement in the curriculum, and they're thinking, how hard can it be? It's the New Testament, and most of them grew up in church and Sunday school, and so I try to explain to them that the way we approach the New Testament in my class is from a historical perspective. That I'm approaching this as a historian. I'm not approaching it as a believer. I'm not assuming any religious knowledge or religious belief for the class. It doesn't matter whether the student is a Christian, or if they're Jewish, or Muslim, or Hindu, or Buddhist, or atheist, or agnostic, or pagan, or anything else. It doesn't matter. Because historians look at what probably happened in the past. And your religious beliefs cannot determine what happened in the past. It either happened in the past, or it didn't happen in the past. And so it doesn't matter for this class what a person's religious beliefs are. This class will not be taught from a believing, confessional, theological perspective, but from a historical perspective. And I tell my students that that's not necessarily a better way to study the New Testament. It's not better, it's simply different from what they've done before. And so it's useful to do something different, and that's what we'll be doing in this class. Once I go through the syllabus and explain the difference between a historical approach and a religious confessional approach, the next thing I do for the second half of the class is I ask everybody to take out a piece of paper and a pen, because I'm going to give them a pop quiz. They think this is a little bit odd that I'm giving them a pop quiz before I've taught them anything. But I'm giving them this pop quiz because, well, my students have grown up in the church and Sunday school, and I want to know before the class begins how much they know about the New Testament before I start. I also want them to know how much they know about the New Testament. And so I give them this quiz. There are 11 questions on this quiz. And most years I begin by telling my class that if anyone in here gets 8 of these 11 right, I'll buy you dinner at the Armadillo Grill. Didn't buy any dinners this year. And the thing is, they're not hard questions. It is amazing how people can be so committed to the Bible and so ignorant about it at the same time. It's that combination of commitment and ignorance, and it's really quite striking. And so I give them this quiz. But just to give you an idea, I'll tell you a couple of questions on the quiz, just so you get an idea of the sort of thing, because it's basic information. It isn't. We're not talking about what scholars have discovered after spending hundreds of years of studying this. We're talking about basic factual information. The first question on this quiz: how many books are in the New Testament? Well, it's a number. I can see some of you are puzzled. Yes, right. Okay, I won't buy you dinner either. So it's actually, at the end, after I give this quiz, we go over the answers and I explain what the answers are. And it's an easy answer to this question. The answer to this question is 27. You can say, well, why is that easy? The reason it's easy is this. When you think about the Bible, you think about God. And when you think about the New Testament, you think about the Christian God, the Trinity. When you think about the Trinity, 3, what is 27? 27 is 3 to the 3rd power. 3 times 3 times 3. It's a miracle. Second question is, in what language were they written, the books of the New Testament? Now, this is an interesting question. I'd say about half of my students generally think that the answer is Hebrew. That's an interesting answer. It's wrong, but it's interesting. And I think the reason they think it's, I don't know why they think it's Hebrew. I suppose they watch these shows on the Discovery Channel or the History Channel about Jesus, and they're always flashing up these Hebrew texts in the background. And so they think Jesus, Israelite, Jewish, Hebrew, it must be Hebrew, right? No, wrong. I get various other answers. Some people think Latin, that's the language of the Roman Empire. He was in the Roman Empire, so no, that's wrong. Aramaic, well, Aramaic's an interesting answer because Aramaic actually was the language that Jesus himself spoke. But the New Testament was not written in Aramaic. Luckily, I normally have only 4 or 5 students who think that the answer is English. No, not English. So the answer is Greek. And the reason it's Greek is because in the Roman Empire, Greek was the lingua franca. Just as today, you can go to Europe, and anywhere you go in Europe, basically, you can get by on English. In the ancient world, you could get by, throughout the Roman Empire, among educated people, you could get by with Greek. And so I'm using this quiz as a way to give some basic factual information before we get on to the real stuff in the class. And so I go through this quiz. I do throw a couple of curveballs in on the quiz, because I don't want to buy any dinners. and so one of the questions is, what was the Apostle Paul's last name? And usually I have some students say, of Tarsus. No, it's not Paul of Tarsus. I mean, it is Paul of Tarsus, but that's not his last name. And I want to have this question because I want them to understand that in the ancient world, most people did not have last names. Unless you were one of the upper crust Roman administrative elites when you'd have many names, basically you just had one name. Everybody had one name. That's why in the New Testament you have all of these people, you have all these people with the same name. And they have to have some way of describing which one they're talking about. So you have all of these women named Mary in the New Testament. And they tell you which Mary they're talking about. Is it Mary, the mother of Jesus? Mary Magdalene? Mary of Bethany? They have to give a descriptor because otherwise you don't know which Mary they're talking about. I want my students to understand this about last names because most of them come into class thinking that Jesus Christ and so I have to tell them it's not Jesus Christ born to Joseph and Mary Christ. Christ is a word that means Messiah. And so somebody says Jesus Christ, they're saying Jesus is the Messiah. And so I go through this quiz, and the students learn something, and I don't have to buy any dinners, and so it's all fine. So, but as I said, this isn't knowledge that is based so much on scholarship, even though it's information that my students don't know. The topic I'm going to talk about tonight is something they really don't know, that is based not just on kind of factual information, although there's a lot of factual information here. It's based on research that scholars have done for a very long time. The question I'm addressing in this talk is who wrote the Bible, the controversial claims of modern scholars. I actually want to begin the talk not with the Bible, but with some books not in the Bible. With some books not in the Bible to set the stage for what I want to say about books in the Bible. I'm going to begin with a gospel that's outside of the New Testament. You may know there are a number of gospels that are not in the New Testament. We know of about 40 from the early centuries that are not in the New Testament. We have some of these completely, some of them partially. And one of the most interesting is a gospel that's called the Gospel of Peter. This Gospel of Peter was known about for centuries. We knew this thing once existed, but we didn't have access to it. We didn't have the thing itself until 1886. In 1886, there was a French archaeological team that was digging in a cemetery in Egypt, in a place called Akhmim, Egypt. They were digging up the cemetery, and they uncovered this tomb that had a body in it that they thought was probably the body of a monk from about the 8th century. And with the monk, there was buried a book. It was a 66-page book that was a small anthology of texts. The first 10 pages contained this book that I'm calling the Gospel of Peter, which is a very interesting book. You can read it online if you want. There are plenty of English translations available about it. One of the most interesting things about this account is that it gives an alternative version of Jesus' passion. It begins actually in the middle of the story. It doesn't give you the whole thing. It begins with Jesus' trial before Pontius Pilate, and it goes through Jesus' trial and his condemnation and his crucifixion and then up to his resurrection. These are events, of course, that are narrated in the New Testament, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But what's interesting is that Peter gives an alternative account. And by far the most interesting aspect of Peter's account is that he actually gives a narration about Jesus' resurrection. Jesus' resurrection is never described in the New Testament. What? Yes, it is. No, it's not. There is no story of Jesus' resurrection in the New Testament. What happens in the New Testament, in all 4 Gospels, is Jesus is buried, and the 3rd day the women go to the tomb, and the tomb is empty. The resurrection has happened at some point, but you don't have a story about the resurrection. You only have the after effect of the resurrection, that the tomb is empty. And then Jesus appears to people after his resurrection. Well, what happened at the resurrection? The Gospel of Peter tells the story. According to the Gospel of Peter, what happened was the Romans set a guard at the tomb to make sure nobody would steal the body. Now that's like what you get in the Gospel of Matthew. But in the Gospel of Peter, as the guard is watching, 2 angelic beings descend from heaven. And as they descend from heaven, the stone in front of Jesus' tomb rolls away. The 2 beings go into the tomb, and as the guard is watching, there are 3 people who emerge from the tomb. 2 of them are so tall that their head reaches up to the sky. They're supporting the 3rd, and the 3rd one's so tall that his head reaches up above the sky. They come out of the tomb, and then behind them emerges out of the tomb a cross. A voice comes from heaven and says, "Have you preached to those who are asleep?" And the cross replies, "Yes." Wow. Okay. A giant Jesus and a walking, talking cross. How this thing got lost for all those centuries, I don't know. It seems like you want to keep this one, but they lost it. So what's it all about? Well, so the reason these angels are taller than humans because they're superhuman, and they're divine beings. And Jesus is taller than them. His head reaches above the sky because he's more superhuman. He's more divine than they are. And the walking, talking cross is a metaphor. The idea of those who are asleep, if you preach to those who are asleep, in the Bible, falling asleep means dying. It's a euphemism for people who died. Has the message of the cross been preached to those who were dead before? What about people who died before Jesus? Can they be saved? Yes, the cross has been preached to those who were asleep. And so this is a metaphorical statement about the significance of Jesus' death by giving an alternative account of his resurrection. Fantastic account. And there's more in the Gospel of Peter that's also interesting. It's a relatively short text. One of the other interesting things about this text is that it claims to be written by Jesus' right-hand man, Simon Peter, one of the 12 disciples. This gospel claims to be written by Peter. Whoever wrote it talks about, I, Peter, said and did this. Nobody on the planet thinks this book was written by Peter. This was not written by Peter. This is written much later, probably in the early 2nd century. It's usually dated to about the year 120, 60 years after 60 years after Peter was laid in his grave. In other words, this is somebody claiming to be someone he was not. What do we call something that is written by someone who claims to be someone they're not? If somebody wrote a book, and it wasn't me, and they signed it Bart Ehrman, what would you say? That's a forgery. Yes, it's a forgery. This is a book that's forged in the name of Peter. I'm going to be pointing out later that ancient people also called these things forgeries, or their Greek and Latin equivalents. These books were understood to be somebody trying to deceive their audience into thinking that they were someone other than who they really were. Well, okay, that's the Gospel of Peter. Well, that's interesting. In addition to a Gospel of Peter, we have a letter of Peter. A letter that allegedly was written by Simon Peter, Jesus' closest disciple, to James, who was the brother of Jesus. After his death, James became the leader of the church of Jerusalem. Historically, that's what we think, is that James became the leader of the church of Jerusalem. And we have a letter allegedly written by Peter, Simon Peter, to James. This letter is found in a group of writings called the Pseudo-Clementines. It's kind of a long name, but they're called that because they're the adventures of a man named Clement, who was the Bishop of Rome at the end of the 1st century. And this letter of Peter to James begins these episodes dealing with this famous Bishop of Rome. So famous, probably none of you have ever heard of him, but he was a very famous person in early Christianity. In this letter, when Peter writes to James, he is talking about somebody who is a missionary, who is taking the gospel to Gentiles. The gospel he takes to Gentiles is a lawless gospel. In other words, it's a gospel that people can be saved without keeping the Jewish law. Well, if you know your Bibles well enough, that will sound familiar. This is clearly referring to Paul, who called himself the apostle to the Gentiles, and who proclaimed that Gentiles did not have to keep the Jewish law to be right with God. Okay, fair enough. But what's interesting is that in this letter, Peter calls Paul the man who is my enemy. Whoa, wait a second. I thought Peter and Paul were on the same page, right? They're both apostles, right? Yes, in the New Testament they're both apostles, and they're on the same page, but not according to the letter of Peter to James outside the New Testament. This is a book, a letter that claims to be written by Peter, but once again, nobody thinks Peter actually wrote this letter. This is another 2nd century forgery. A book claiming to be written by Peter, claiming to represent Peter's view, that in fact is not. I mean, probably doesn't represent Peter's view, but it claims to be. Okay. We have another book connected with Peter that's called the Apocalypse of Peter. In some ways, this is my favorite of these 3 texts. The Apocalypse of Peter was also found in 1886. In fact, it was one of the 4 other writings in that manuscript that was discovered with the person who was thought to be a monk. This 66-page manuscript had 4 writings in it, and one of them was the Apocalypse of Peter. The Apocalypse of Peter is particularly interesting, I think, because it's our first surviving, first-hand account of a guided tour of heaven and hell. Whoa, okay. You're familiar with Dante's Divine Comedy, where Dante is given a tour of the realms of the blessed and the realms of the damned, as well as the realm of purgatory. Dante did not invent the idea of being given a guided tour of heaven and hell. This idea goes way back, and the first instance of a Christian text where a Christian is given a tour of the realms of the blessed and realms of the damned is this text, the Apocalypse of Peter. Peter is given this guided tour by Jesus himself. when he goes to the realms of the blessed, he describes what heaven is like. And I have to be frank with you, the description of heaven is not all that interesting. The reason it's not all that interesting is because there's only so much you can say about eternal bliss. I mean, people are fantastically happy. Yay, blessed are the saints in the heavenly realms. Yay, blessed and happy. Oh, joyful are they. Yay, very joyful. Happy, blessed are they, the saints in the heavenly realm. What do you say? I mean, you know, it's eternal bliss. That's great. So, so that part is not all that interesting. If you have any imagination, though, and any creativity, and you want to describe the torments of the damned, you can come up with some really juicy stuff. And the descriptions of hell are far more interesting than the descriptions of heaven. It turns out in hell, according to this guided tour that Peter has given, according to this description of hell, some sinners are eternally punished for whatever their characteristic sin was. For example, people who were habitual liars are hanged by their tongues over eternal flames. Ooh, they lied with their mouth, so they're hung by their tongues. Women who have braided their hair to make themselves attractive so they can seduce men are hanged by their hair over eternal flames. The men they seduced are hanged by a different body part over eternal flames, and the men cry out, "We didn't know it would come to this." Which I'm sure is true. And the point of this account is pretty clear. If you want to go to the realms of the blessed and not to the realms of the damned, don't sin. Be a good person. Well, okay, so this is very interesting. This, again, is written by somebody claiming to be Peter. The interesting thing in this case, this book almost made it into the New Testament. There were church fathers who thought this apocalypse of Peter should be in the New Testament, and the apocalypse of John should not be in the New Testament, the book of Revelation. There were arguments about whether Revelation should be in or this one should be in, or if this one instead, or both of them together, or neither. So it almost made it in. It turns out, though, of course, it was not really written by Peter. It's a 2nd century forgery. It's a book that claims to be written by somebody who did not write it. Well, I've given you 3 examples of books claiming to be written by Peter that were not written by Peter, and it turns out that's not all. There were other forgeries in the name of Peter. We have a book called the Acts of Peter. This is an interesting account. In this account, we have an account of Peter's missionary episodes after Jesus' resurrection. My favorite account in this is Peter's going around converting people, and there's this episode where he's by a body of water preaching to a crowd, and of course he's by a body of water because in the New Testament he's a fisherman, so he's connected with water, and so he's talking to these people, and nobody's buying it, nobody's converting, and he's not having any luck at all, and he's right next to this large lake that he's next to. There's a fishmonger shop selling fish. And in the fishmonger shop in the window, there's a smoked tuna fish that's hanging there. And Peter says, "If I make this smoked tuna fish come back to life, will you believe me then?" "Oh, yes, Peter, then we'll believe in the gospel." And so Peter goes over and grabs the tuna fish and throws it in the water and orders it to come alive in the name of Jesus. And it comes back to life. And it starts swimming around. And they feed it. I mean, it's back alive. So everybody converts. And so this is the famous story of Peter and the smoked tuna. So you have these episodes about Peter's missionary activities. We have other letters that claim to be written by Peter that certainly were not written by Peter. We have other apocalypses that claim to be written by Peter that were not written by Peter. Writing books in the name of Peter was a cottage industry in early Christianity. There were a lot of people who were doing this. They're all different people writing all these books claiming to be Peter. So this is just Peter. I mean, I could do something similar with other famous Christians. Paul, John, Thomas. We have gospels by all of these people. Gospel by Mary. We have all sorts of these other books. And so my question is, if it's without doubt that there are books outside the New Testament that are not written by the people who claim to be writing them, is it possible that there are books like that inside the New Testament? Can there be books like that, that we know exist, that made it into the New Testament? Let me say a few words about background. First, the prominence of forgery in antiquity. I spent several years of my life doing nothing but reading about forgery in the ancient world. It turns out there were a lot of forgeries in the ancient world. A lot more than we get now. We still get some now, but it doesn't happen very often because with our electronic means of publication and mass literacy and ways of checking these things that we have now that are readily available to us, it's a lot harder. But if you're living in a world where 97% of the population, like in ancient Palestine, 97% of the population couldn't read in Peter's land, Palestine. If you can't read, it's kind of hard to detect a forgery. People could get away with things. And there were lots of forgeries written. I have data on dozens and dozens of forgeries. Forgeries written by pagans, forgeries written by Jews, forgeries written by Christians. It was fairly prominent. We also know it was prominent, by the way, because ancient people talked about it. Ancient people talked about the fact that books were circulating in the names of people who did not actually write them. What were the attitudes toward forgery in the ancient world? Well, the short story is they did not approve of it. They tell us they did not approve of it. In ancient Greek, there are two words that get applied to our word forgery. Our word forgery, of course, is an English word. There was an equivalent word in Greek that was sometimes applied. Something made up, it was called a forgery. The two most common words for a book like this, like the Gospel of Peter that claims to be written by somebody who did not write it, the most common words were the word pseudos, which meant a lie. We call these books lies. And the word nothos. Nothos is a Greek word that means a child born outside of wedlock. It carried all of the negative connotations as our word bastard. And so they called these books lies and bastards. Well, that's not a very positive thing to say. No, well, they didn't think very positively about this phenomenon. It was practiced, but it was condemned. Well, why would people practice something if it was condemned? Yeah, well, think about that one for a while. What can we say specifically about attitudes towards forgery? Well, let me just tell you a couple of instances. First, from non-Christian literature. One of the most prolific authors of the ancient world was a physician named Galen, who lived in the 2nd Christian century. Galen wrote tons of books. We have tons of his books. We have so many of his books, a lot of them are not even translated into English. We have so many, they haven't been able to translate them all. We have tons of books by Galen. Galen wrote an autobiography, a short autobiography, in which he describes something that once happened in his life. He was walking through a street in Rome, and he was going by a bookseller shop. And in the window of the bookseller shop, there were two men arguing about a book. One of them had just bought the book and was telling the other one that it was a book written by Galen. The other one picked up the book, looked at it, read the first line, and said, "This can't be Galen. It's the wrong writing style." And so Galen overheard this conversation about a book allegedly written by him, Galen, but the deal was he had not written the book. And so that afternoon he went home and he did write a book that was called How to Recognize Books Written by Galen. He didn't like the idea that people, of course he didn't like the idea. How would you like if somebody wrote a book in your name and said it was you when it wasn't you? Well, you wouldn't like it. They didn't like it in the ancient world either. We get an interesting phenomenon in some Christian literature. There's a book that is called the Apostolic Constitutions. This is not a book that people generally know. Scholars know about it. It was a book written in the 4th Christian century. It was written in the 4th Christian century. It's called the Apostolic Constitutions because it claims to be written by the apostles of Jesus in the 1st century. It claims to be written by the apostles of Jesus in the 1st century, and sometimes they talk in the first person. And so you have these passages where you say things like, I, Peter, say to you so-and-so and so-and-so. I, John, say to you so-and-so and so-and-so. I, James, say to you so-and-so and so-and-so. And so there are people claiming to be the apostles. It's very interesting that in one chapter of this long book, the apostles warn their readers not to read books that claim to be written by apostles but aren't. What? Yes. The authors claiming to be the apostles, even though they weren't, tell their readers, don't read books that claim to be written by apostles but aren't. Why would they do that? They would do that because it throws the reader off the scent of their own deceit. You don't think that they're doing what they're condemning. So that is actually a typical ploy that you get in ancient forgeries. One of the ways you make forgeries convincing. How about in the New Testament? The book of 2 Thessalonians. Well, this is an interesting case. 2 Thessalonians is a book in the New Testament that claims to be written by Paul. There are 13 books in the New Testament. Out of the 27, there are 13 that claim to be written by Paul. 2 Thessalonians is one of these that claims to be written by Paul. In 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 2, the author warns his readers against a letter allegedly by us. In other words, a letter that's circulating in the name of Paul. Don't be put off by that letter because it's not really by us. The irony is that for over 100 years, scholars have thought that Paul did not write 2 Thessalonians. So once again, it would be an author who is forging a book telling you, don't read books that are forged. In this case, it's kind of an interesting thing because this instance shows us definitively that there are forgeries in Paul's name floating around. Either 2 Thessalonians really is written by Paul, in which case Paul knows that there's a forgery in his name that he's warning them against. Or 2 Thessalonians itself is a book written in forgery in the name of Paul. Either way, there's a forgery being circulated in the name of Paul. So it's kind of almost a watertight case. Okay, well, right, so can there be forgeries in the New Testament? My view is if there are forgeries outside of the New Testament, how couldn't there be forgeries inside the New Testament? The New Testament was not put together the year after Jesus died. The New Testament didn't come to be compiled for centuries. It was centuries before you ended up with our books. People living centuries later, they didn't know who wrote these books. They assumed that Paul wrote 2 Thessalonians. Of course they did. It's not until modern times that scholars have suspected that in fact he did not. So what can we say about possible New Testament forgeries? Well, I've talked about a number of books claiming to be written by Peter from outside the New Testament that were not written by Peter. There are 2 books in the New Testament that also claim to be written by Peter. 1st and 2nd Peter. These are short letters in the New Testament. One thing we can say with relative certainty is that whoever wrote 1 Peter did not write 2 Peter. We can say that because when you study the Greek writing style of the 2 books, they are completely different. It's like at one time you're reading, what are you reading? You're reading Stephen King, and the other time you're reading James Joyce. These are not the same thing. You got a different author here, and that's why they acknowledge. The question is, did Peter write either one of them? My personal view of this is that Peter did not write either 1 Peter or 2 Peter, even though both of them claim to be written by Peter. One of my many reasons for thinking that Peter did not write either 1 Peter or 2 Peter is because I don't think Peter could write. Period. Who could write in the ancient world? Well, there have been very interesting studies of this phenomenon. The best study is written by a Columbia University professor named William Harris, who wrote a book called Ancient Literacy, who shows that at the best of times in antiquity, 10 to 15% of the population could read and write. Far more people could read than could write. Today we teach those two things together. In our classes, students learn to read and write at the same time. But in the ancient world, they taught reading. Writing came at a higher level. So more people could read than could write. More people could write by copying a document than could compose a writing. More people could compose a writing than could compose a book. More people could compose a writing, could compose a book, than could compose a book in fairly eloquent Greek, especially if that was their second language. How high was literacy in ancient Palestine? The best study is by a woman named Catherine Hefner, what was called Literacy in Ancient Palestine. She thinks that probably in the days of Jesus and Peter, somewhere around 3% of the population could read and write. 3%. Who are these 3%? They are the highly educated, wealthy elite who live in the cities. Rural people could not read and write. There's this kind of myth that floats around that in the ancient Judaism, all boys went to synagogue school and learned how to read and write. It's a complete myth. In fact, somewhere around 3%, 4%, something like that. And that's the literary elite who are very wealthy in urban settings. Was Peter a literary elite in an urban setting? Well, no. In the New Testament, he's a rural guy. He lives out in the country in a small village, and he's a fisherman. He never went to school. He never learned to read and write, and his native language was Aramaic. 1st and 2nd Peter are written in highly elegant Greek. From the 1st century, how many Jews do we know of from Palestine who wrote in Greek? The answer? We know 1. From the entire 1st century, 100 years, 1. And he was a very high-placed literary elite who says that he could write better in Aramaic. He had trouble writing in Greek. That's a Jewish historian, Josephus. Wow. Okay. So did Peter write 1st and 2nd Peter? I don't think so. Okay. Well, maybe Peter dictated a letter, and somebody else wrote it. Well, no. To compose a letter even by dictation, you've got to have an education, and Peter didn't have an education. Maybe Peter told somebody, "I'd like you to write this letter, and here's what I'd like you to say," and they wrote it in Greek. I mean, you can come up with all sorts of possibilities. I have 2 books written on this question of forgery in early Christianity, and in both of them, I deal with this possibility that maybe Peter used a secretary. I looked up every reference that we know of to secretaries in the ancient world, in Greek and Latin sources. And there is nothing analogous to this, where somebody asks someone else to write a letter in their name in another language and basically tells them what's written. We don't have the evidence for it. My conclusion, 1st and 2nd Peter were not written by Peter. They were written by somebody claiming to be Peter. Why would you claim to be Peter if you weren't Peter? Well, you can think of a lot of reasons you might think of a lot of reasons why somebody might do that, but I can tell you the reason typically this happened in early Christianity. You wanted somebody to read your book. Your name was Fred Smith. They never heard of you. You want them to read your book, so you don't sign it Fred Smith, you sign it Peter. And then people read your book. My guess is that's what's going on with 1st and 2nd Peter by 2 different authors claiming to be Peter, just like you get the Gospel of Peter, the Apocalypse of Peter, the other Epistle of Peter. So, the letters of Paul. 13 books claim to be written by Paul in the New Testament. Since the 19th century, scholars have argued that 6 of these probably do not go back to Paul. 6 of Paul's letters probably were not actually written by Paul. You'll notice I'm not giving you much evidence here. I could be giving a different lecture where I give you the evidence that the book of Ephesians and the book of 2nd Thessalonians was not actually written by Paul, and if in question and answer you want me to give some of the evidence, I can give you some of it, but it's a lot of evidence. It takes a long time, but I'm just telling you, since the 19th century, critical scholars have argued about 6 of the 13 letters. Let me tell you the common scholarly view of the final tally, divided into different categories. Begin with works in the New Testament that you might call homonymous. Well, you might call them homonymous if you use words like homonymous. So if you don't use the word like homonymous, what that word means is written in the same name. That refers to the fact that there are some books in the ancient world that are written by somebody who has the same name as a famous person. And later readers thought that the person who was just telling you who he was claiming to be the famous person. If he wasn't, he just had the same name as the famous person. You know what I mean? Most people don't have last names. And so you write in your name. And so, for example, the Revelation of John in the New Testament. The Apocalypse of John, the last book of the New Testament, the book of Revelation. It claims to be written by John, but it doesn't tell you which John he is. Later, Christians said, oh, that's Jesus' disciple, John the son of Zebedee. That's why it got in the New Testament. Because people were concluded, oh, it must have been written by John the son of Zebedee. But almost certainly it was not written by John the son of Zebedee. For one thing, like Peter, he was a fisherman from rural Galilee and he couldn't write. But apart from that, this author appears to have a vision in his book of the 12 apostles. And he gives no indication that he thinks he's seeing himself. Probably this may be homonymous. It might be written but just by some guy named John, and later people thought, oh, it's that John. Similar with the book of James in the New Testament, some people think that this is just, the Epistle of James has traditionally been thought to have been written by Jesus' brother James. Well, I don't think so, but maybe it's just some other person named James. It's a common name, very common name in the ancient world. That's possible. It's also possible that it's somebody who wants you to think that it's really that James, and it wasn't that James. So well, those two might be homonymous. There are some books in the New Testament that are probably falsely attributed to famous people. By falsely attributed, what I mean is, these are books that do not, these are books for which the author does not claim to be somebody. He doesn't claim that his name is Peter, or Paul, or John, or James. He doesn't give his name. But later readers said, oh, that book was written by so-and-so. And if that attribution is false, if it's wrong, then it's falsely attributed. But it's not the author's fault. You know, it's not that the author's making some kind of claim. It's not writing a forgery. He's just writing a book. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John fit into that bill. They don't claim to be written by people named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These are later ascriptions. The first time we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John called Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is 100 years after they were put in circulation. Before then, people didn't call them anything. They just said, they said, well, it's in the gospel, and they just named, they didn't name who wrote them. These are later attributions, and there are very good reasons for thinking that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John didn't write Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. One of them being, again, the apostles of Jesus were Aramaic-speaking peasants from rural Galilee, and these books are written in highly literate Greek. So that makes you think, well, maybe not so much. The book of Acts is usually is almost always thought to have been written by the same person who wrote the Gospel of Luke. Luke and Acts are two volumes of the same work, so it's attributed to Luke, but again, there are reasons for thinking that he did not write it. The book of Hebrews was almost not included in the New Testament, but finally church fathers thought, well, maybe it was written by Paul. It doesn't claim to be written by Paul, but even if you read your King James Bible, it'll say the Epistle to the Hebrews by the Apostle Paul. Well, that's just an editor telling you, a modern editor telling you who they think wrote the book, but the book doesn't claim to be written by Paul. It almost certainly was not written by Paul, for reasons I can go into if you want to. Critical scholars don't have much of a debate about this. It doesn't claim to be written by Paul, probably wasn't written by Paul. These would all be falsely attributed writings. So too 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. These are not the Gospel of John. These are the 3 letters of John. But the author, again, doesn't tell you who he is. He doesn't claim to be John, and there's nothing about this to make you think it was John. So these are all probably falsely attributed, not the author's fault. It's someone else later tell you who wrote these books. Are there literary forgeries in the New Testament? This is a common tally among critical scholars of the New Testament. When I say critical scholars of the New Testament, I mean people who aren't fundamentalists, who approach the New Testament from a historical perspective, who are not approaching it compassionately, but just historically trying to figure out what really happened. Did these people write the books or not? There are 6 letters of Paul that appear to be written by someone other than Paul. Ephesians, Colossians, 2 Thessalonians, 1 and 2 Timothy, and Titus. The book of James, I think, is somebody trying to make you think that it really is James, the brother of Jesus, and almost certainly it was not James, the brother of Jesus. And then there's 1 and 2 Peter, which probably were not written by Peter. The book of Jude. Jude is another book that claims to be written by one of Jesus' brothers. And again, there are very good reasons for thinking that this was written much later, long after Jude, the brother of Jesus, had died. So those may well be literary forgeries. You'll be happy to hear that there are some authentic writings in the New Testament. Some books are written by people who claim to be their authors, and this is just what most scholars think, which are that there are 7 letters of Paul that Paul almost certainly wrote. Romans, 1 and 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. Scholars have studied this issue intensely, and there are scholars who devote an entire scholarly career to studying the question of whether Paul wrote these letters. It's been 30 years studying this question, so I'm just kind of giving you what scholars have concluded after intensive study. 7 Pauline letters are almost certainly authentic, and the Revelation of John may authentically have been written by somebody named John. So that would be authentic. So let me give you the final results. They're surprising results. Very surprising for people who are not accustomed to this approach to the New Testament. There are probably 7 or 8 authentic writings in the New Testament. There's 1 or no homonymous writings, maybe Revelation, if you count that as a homonymous writing. 8 writings that are wrongly attributed to people who did not write them. And 11 writings in the New Testament that appear to be forged. So that's our 27 books. Okay, well, let me give you some residual questions. You may have some residual questions. These are the ones I want to ask. How prevalent was the practice of literary forgery in the ancient world? Well, it was prevalent. We have dozens of instances of writings from the Roman world, the Greek world, that are literary forgeries. It was a fairly common practice. We have instances in Jewish circles, although not nearly as many, but then again we don't have as many Jewish writings. And we have a lot of Christian examples. It was a fairly prevalent practice in the ancient world. How prevalent was it among the early Christians? It appears to be pretty prevalent. This is not much debated for books from outside the New Testament. It's not much debated for books outside the New Testament because we have all these other books. I mean, we have all these Gospels. Gospels claiming to be written by Jesus' brother Jude, Thomas, Gospel by his disciple Philip, Gospel by Nicodemus, Gospel of Mary, a Gospel, there's a whole ton of these things, and nobody thinks these people really wrote them. Christians were claiming to be people that they weren't. Was it actually condemned? This comes as a surprise to many people because, well, why does it come as a surprise? When I was in graduate school, we all told one another that in fact it was an acceptable practice in the ancient world to write in the name of someone else. That's what we learned. That's what we said. That's what we thought. When I started doing my research on this, I did most of my research on this back in the early 2000s. No, mid-2000s. And I decided to look into that question. Where did we get the idea that it was a commonly acceptable practice to write in the name of someone else? It appears that someone just made that up. Well, some modern scholar just made it up. I looked at every reference I could find in every Greek and Latin author of the ancient world, every reference to this phenomenon, and I never found somebody who approved of it. They always condemned it. They condemned it and they called it a form of lying, a form of deceit. That, of course, is troubling because we're talking about the New Testament here. But I'm approaching this historically. I'm just asking, did Peter really write 2 Peter? And if he didn't, what would ancient people say about that? A book claiming to be written by somebody who didn't write? Well, they condemned it. If they condemned it, why was it practiced? In my two books on this, I've got one book that's for scholars that I can assure you, you do not want to read. It's 600 pages and it's dense and you don't want to go there. I have another book that's simply called Forge that is written for normal human beings as opposed to abnormal scholars. And in the book for normal, the book Forge, I give a list of reasons why in the ancient world people forged things. We actually know because the ancient authors talk about why did people forge things. Sometimes they forge things in order to make money. How would that make money? Well, if you could sell your book to a bookseller and they would sell it, then you'd get the money. Or if there was a museum, as happens sometimes, or a library, if there was an ancient library that was collecting original writings of Plato, you'd be amazed how many original writings of Plato start showing up. And they pay money for it. So sometimes there was a monetary incentive. Sometimes people would write forgeries as a kind of a prank. So, like, there's this one instance we know this one instance. This ancient philosopher had this philosophical enemy. His enemy was another philosopher, and so what he did is he wrote 50 obscene letters in the name of this other guy, and circulated them around in his own circle, and so this guy became a persona non grata. So like he's kicked out of the city, and he's like, and because he's just doing this to kind of get at the guy. So there's that kind of thing. Yeah, there are a whole bunch of reasons why you might want to write a forgery, but the most common reason is because you want people to read your book. And if you're a philosopher and you're some nobody, and you want people to read your book, and you can't really circulate it in your name because they're not going to read it then. But if you call yourself Plato or Socrates or some other famous, then somebody might read your book. So it's not so you'll become famous because your name's hidden. It's so that your ideas will get out there because what you think you're going to want to say is important. Christian authors thought what they had to say was important. This was a serious business for them. There were different views of what Christianity was supposed to be in the ancient world. Lots of people had their opinions. It should be this, but it can't be that. I firmly believe that. Well, how am I going to get that idea across? I'm going to write a book, and I'm going to claim to be an authority. I'm going to claim to be an authority so that people will pay attention to what I have to say. In early Christianity, there were different views about whether it is ever legitimate to tell a lie. In early Christianity, there were different views about whether it's ever legitimate to tell a lie. Just as we today, many of us think that sometimes it's appropriate to tell a lie. If you're hiding a Jew in your house during, in 1943 in an occupied territory, and somebody knocks on your door and asks if you're hiding anybody, then of course you say no. You lie, because it's appropriate sometimes to tell a lie. There were some people in early Christianity who said it is never, ever right to tell a lie. St. Augustine, 5th century, it is never right to tell a lie. Even if by telling a lie you will keep your daughter from being gang raped or even being sent to hell for eternity. If by telling a lie you'll keep her from being raped or keep her from being sent to hell for eternity, you should not tell the lie, says St. Augustine. St. Augustine. Wow, that's extreme. Yeah. There were other people who had the opposite view. Of course there are instances when it's right to lie. If you have to lie to a patient to get them to take their medicine, then you should lie to your patient. Of course. And so, sometimes it was thought that the ends justified the means. Telling a lie in order to achieve the right ends could be a good thing. My guess is that early Christian authors who claimed to be Peter, or claimed to be Paul, or John, or James, or Thomas, or Philip, or Mary, knowing they weren't that person, were telling a lie for that reason, because they thought that the ends justified the means. Could there be such things in the Bible? My view is yes, there could be such things in the Bible, and there probably were such things in the Bible. There are such things in the Bible. Books that claim to be written by authors who, in fact, did not write them. Thank you very much. I'm going to take questions, and what I'll do is I will take a question. Please try to keep them to questions as opposed to sermons or whatever else. And if you have a kind of a pointed question, please give it to me, and I'll repeat it so people in the back can know what the question is. Yes?
I was wondering if we are aware of any particular social difficulties that were happening at the time when the Bible was compiled, and if we can tell if any of the books that were selected as those that were rejected address those particular issues.
Thank you. The question is, do we know of any kind of social problems that were erupting during when the Bible was being compiled that may have led Christians to accept some books rather than other books in the canon? It's a very good question, and it's a complicated question about how did we get our canon of the New Testament. The answer is yes, there were social issues, but the social issues tended to be rooted around different understandings of what Christianity was supposed to be. And so you had different theological points of view in early Christianity. Just to give you one example, there were Christians in the 2nd and 3rd century, the 2nd and 3rd century mainly. So, 100 years, 200 years after the New Testament was written, there were Christians who said that Jesus was a human being, but since he was a human being, he could not be a divine being. I mean, a human can't be a god any more than a human can be a rock. I mean, they're different things, right? So he was human, and he was the Son of God, but he wasn't God. There were other people who said, no, Christ is a divine being. He's God, and since he's God, he's not really a human. He only seemed to be a human. There are other people who said, actually, Jesus Christ is two things. Jesus is a man, and Christ is a God, and they were temporarily united for his ministry, which is, at his baptism, the divine Christ came into Jesus to empower him for his ministry, and then when he died, the Christ left him. That's why Christ on the cross cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Because God had left him. And so you had Christians saying that. You had other Christians who said, no, Jesus Christ is one being, not two, and he's both human and divine at the same time. So those are four options, and there are other options. And so the people who are debating these things, one side of that won the debate. The side that won the debate is the side that said Jesus is both human and divine at the same time. Those people who won the debate are the ones who chose which books would be in the New Testament. And they were the power players. They chose which books would be in the New Testament. So naturally, they picked the books that they thought would support their point of view, which is one reason the Gospel of Peter didn't get in. Because it was thought to be a book that was read by these people who said that Christ was God, but he's not human. And so that's why they didn't accept it. Yes, in the back.
What's the earliest manuscript that we have in existence today, and where could we see some?
What is the earliest manuscript of the New Testament?
Yes.
Yeah, that we have today. There's a manuscript that's called P52. It's called P52. The P stands for papyrus, because the ancient writing material before they used paper, they used papyrus, which is a reed. It's a reed that grows by the Nile River. They could manufacture writing material. This looks kind of like paper. So this is papyrus. It's P52 because it's the 52nd papyrus that was discovered and cataloged. It is a fragmentary copy of the Gospel of John that is usually dated to the early 2nd century. So roughly, let's say the year 125, plus or minus 25 years. So it might have been 110, it might be 140, but around 125. So that's really good because that's really, really early. What's not so good is that P52 is the size of a credit card. And I'm not saying that all of the Gospel of John is written on this. I'm saying that it has a few verses from John chapter 18 and 19. Not a few verses, it has a few words from a few verses in John 18 and 19. It's our earliest. Our earliest lengthy manuscript, where like you'd have entire pages or most of pages, date from around the year 200 or 220. Our earliest complete manuscript, where you actually have an entire book, like all of Matthew, starting beginning of Matthew, the end of Matthew, is not until the middle of the 4th century, 4th Christian century. Yeah. Yes? Yes, you. Yes.
In light of your issue of forgeries, do you have an opinion about the Gospel of Judas?
Yes, I do have an opinion about the Gospel of Judas. How much time is this question and answer going to go, by the way?
However long you want to go.
All right, so let me tell you about the story about the Gospel of Judas. Right, so we got some time, why not? Right. Okay, so in about 2005, I was sitting in my office, and the phone rings at UNC. I pick up my phone. And it's a woman who I know, who has sponsored archaeological digs in Israel. And I've known her for years. We chat for a while, small talk. I'm not sure why she's called, because she's never called me in her life. And we chat for a while. And then she says, what do you know about the Gospel of Judas? And I said, well, we don't have a Gospel of Judas. And I said, but the church fathers mentioned the Gospel of Judas, but it's lost. We don't have it. And she said, oh, okay, thanks. And she hung up. That was that. Huh, that's weird. So I decided, well, maybe I should look into it. I don't, there's something like I should know more information about this. I looked it up and I read all the references to it in the church fathers. There's a reference to the Gospel of Judas in a 2nd century church father named Irenaeus, writing around the year 180, 185. He wrote a book against heretics, against false believers. And in this book, he talks about these various groups of Christians who believe weird things. And there was one group of Christians that he called Cainites. Cainites were called Cainites because they revered Cain, as in Cain and Abel. Now that's a weird person to revere. If you remember, Cain murdered Abel. And so you revere the first murderer? What? Well, the deal with the Cainites, according to Irenaeus, is this. The Cainites believed that the God who created this world, who was the God of the Jews, was a lower divinity, and there was a greater divinity above him. The God who created this world is the God of the Old Testament. So, anyone in the Old Testament who is opposed to their God is actually on the side of the true God. And so the Cainites revered Cain. They adored the men from Sodom and Gomorrah. And they had a gospel by Judas Iscariot, the betrayer. That was their gospel. And so Irenaeus tells us this. So I think, wow, that's interesting. I'd forgotten that. That's pretty interesting. So, that was that. 2 weeks later, my phone rings. Pick it up. It's a woman from the Smithsonian. And she introduces herself, and she says, what do you know about the Gospel of Judas? Yeah. So I tell her what I know, and I say, okay, so what's the deal? And she says, well, would you think it would be significant if we discovered it? Would it be significant? Yes, it'd be significant. What do you mean it would be significant? So she said, well, what? I said, well, look. I said, okay, it could be one of two things. I said, suppose it's a gospel like these other lost gospels that we've discovered in recent times that are Gnostic. The Gnostic Gospels that talk about these gods who are above the God of the Old Testament and how the God of the Old Testament is inferior and like it's this alternative form of Christianity. If I said, if you found something like that, that'd be really interesting to scholars like me. But if you found a Gospel of Judas where like Judas and Jesus talk to each other and Jesus explains why Judas has to betray him or like there's something like that, I said, that would be front page news. So what do you have? He said, well, we think we have it. It was actually discovered in the 1970s, but it's been hidden away, and now it's come to light. And we would like you to help us authenticate it. I said, wow, okay. What language is it written in? It's written in ancient Coptic. I said, oh, so Coptic's it's an ancient Egyptian language. I said, well, I read Coptic, but it's not really my research language. I said, wait, you don't really need me. You need a Coptologist. She said, okay. What's a Coptologist? A Coptologist is an expert in ancient Coptic. I mean, if it's in Coptic, you need somebody who's an expert in Coptic. So they agree. She said, oh, yeah, okay, yeah, that's good. She said, but really what we want to do is we want to date the manuscript. We want to know when it was produced. I said, yeah, well, that's good. I said, but to date a manuscript, you need a paleographer. Oh, okay. What's a paleographer? A paleographer is somebody who studies ancient handwriting. He said the way you date an ancient manuscript is done on the basis of a handwriting analysis. So you need somebody who's a Coptic paleographer. She said, no, okay. But we thought maybe we could carbon 14 date the manuscript. She said, can you help us with that? No, I can't help you with that. I'm not a scientist. My field is Greek literature. I mean, no, I can't. I said, look, okay, I'll tell you what. You find a scientist who can carbon 14 date the manuscript, and I'll get you a Coptic paleographer. And so we agreed. But then she said, no. She said, look, but we want you to be involved in this because we want to be able to situate this gospel, if it's authentic, in its historical context. I said, oh, I can do that. That's what I do. I said, yeah, I'd be happy to help with that. So she said, okay, you get the Coptic paleographer. So get on the phone, make a phone call. I've got a friend who teaches in Germany. He wasn't actually a friend. He's an acquaintance who taught in Germany who happened to be a Coptic paleographer. He was like the best Coptic paleographer in the world. His name was Stephen Emmel. Call him up and said, Stephen, I said, I don't know if you've heard, but they think they discovered the Gospel of Judas. He said, oh, he said, yeah. He said, I heard that. He said, I saw it 20 years ago. Oh, you want to see it again? He said, yes. I said, okay, well, it's in Switzerland. I said, you want to go to Switzerland? He said, yeah. So we went to Switzerland. And so we flew, and we flew to Switzerland. We met up. There was a team, there was a National Geographic team, and they brought it out. And, you know, there it was. It was this gospel written in Coptic. And Judas Iscariot, the Gospel of Judas, I mean, it's like right there. And so Stephen could relatively date it. They did get a carbon 14 guy who relatively dated it. It looks like it's debated still, but it's probably around produced in the 4th century. But the text itself the gospel would have been composed in the 2nd century because Irenaeus knew about it already. And this looks like it was the text that Irenaeus knew. So this is the Gospel of Judas that now you can just get. You can just go online and get an English translation of this thing. All right, so I forgot what your question was. What's my opinion?
Authentic.
Is it authentic?
By Judas.
No, it doesn't. It does not claim to be written by Judas. It's a gospel that is portraying things in which Judas is the main character in the story, and it's much debated how to interpret this text. Yes. So if you want kind of a fuller account of all that, I wrote a book about this called The Lost Gospel of Judas Iscariot, where I describe the discovery and why it was gone for 20 years and why it reappeared and how it was authenticated and probably what it means and all that. Yes.
My New Testament class in seminary used your textbook, and so it's a pleasure
okay,
to
great.
hear
Where
your
was that?
lecture. So, you know, we learn all this awesome stuff in seminary. We get out into the real world, ready on fire, going to teach our congregations all this stuff that we learned.
Yeah.
And they look at you like you're talking crazy.
Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
suggest that perhaps Paul did not write all 13 of those letters.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I do love my parishioners. I have 2 of my parishioners with me tonight, so I do love them.
Yeah. Yeah.
But do you get any backlash for what you teach, and how? Do you have any advice for pastors that are in the parish trying to introduce these ideas to a congregation?
Right. So I don't get much pushback from my students because they already know I'm going to be like that, and so they they kind of know. So I don't get a lot of pushback. I think that it's a shame that pastors learn this material in seminary and then don't tell anybody about it, because basically they're keeping their people ignorant. And if you learn this material, it doesn't mean that you're going to leave the faith now. I mean, if you're a pastor and you know this, you haven't left the faith. Why should anyone else leave the faith? The faith has nothing to do with whether Peter wrote 2 Peter or not, unless you're a fundamentalist. I mean, you're a fundamentalist, yes. But if you're not a fundamentalist, I mean, if you're a fundamentalist, you think he wrote it anyway. So if you don't think Peter wrote 2 Peter, you're not a fundamentalist. So I think that you have to figure out, if you're a pastor, you have to figure out, why has this not destroyed my faith? Why hasn't it? And since it hasn't, how can I introduce this so it doesn't hurt the faith of others? It makes them more knowledgeable about their faith. Because the contrast to being knowledgeable about your faith is being ignorant about your faith. And who wants to have an ignorant faith? I mean, a lot of people in my part of the world, but I mean, but you should want to know. So I think you have to figure, I don't think it's appropriate to preach this kind of thing from the pulpit, myself, my personal opinion. I don't think it'd be ever appropriate to say, well, we know Paul didn't really write 2 Thessalonians, from the pulpit. But there are adult education classes. And I think adults want to get educated. And so you have to figure out, of course, you've got to be gentle, and you've got to be pastoral, and you've got to be theological. But, history is history, and people have the right to know. I'm not sure if that answered your question. Yeah.
Given that you have the books outside the canon, the Gospels, the letters, how significant were those Gospels and letters in that time period?
Yeah, how significant were these other Gospels and letters, things from outside the New Testament? How significant were they in the time period? Some of them were fairly significant. Like say the Apocalypse of Peter appears to have been read fairly widely. On a historical basis, part of the problem is the way we know what was important in early Christianity is from the writings from early Christianity that have come down to us. And almost all the writings from early Christianity that come down to us are the writings that were produced by the winners.
Right.
The writings by the losers got destroyed, or just they weren't copied, and so we don't have them anymore. And so we can't really tell a lot of times how significant something was. Some of these false opinions, things that were labeled as false opinions, are attacked so vociferously by the winners that it makes you think it was a big deal. Right? We don't have any of the writings, but they wouldn't be attacking them so hard if they were unimportant. And so it looks like they're important, but we just don't have their writings, and so it's a little bit hard to know. Like the Gospel of Peter, for example, the walking, talking, cross thing. The only reason we knew about the Gospel of Peter is because there was a church father in the 2nd century whose name was Serapion, and Serapion we know about Serapion. Before I tell you about Serapion, we know about Serapion not because we have any of his writings, but because a church father living 120 years later wrote about it, mentioned him in his account of early church history. A man named Eusebius wrote about Serapion and hundreds of other people. What Eusebius tells us about Serapion is that Serapion found that some people in one of his churches were using the Gospel of Peter, and he said it's fine to use it. Peter wrote it, that's fine. And it's only when somebody told him, actually, it represents a false teaching, that he read it and said, nah, I don't think so. And then he excluded its use. So we wouldn't know the story unless Eusebius told us, and we don't have anything written by the side that used the gospel, so we don't know how significant it is. Any other questions? I'll take one more that I think is
Determine what books made scripture.
Who determined which books made scripture? Right. Okay, we'll be here for 3 more hours. Right. Yeah. Right. Okay. So I'll give you the rough outline. The way it worked was this: there were lots of books floating around in early Christianity, and Christians wanted to know what's the right thing to believe and what's the right way to live. What is the Christian way to believe? What do we believe about Christ? What do we believe about God? What do we believe about salvation? What do we believe about the world? What do we believe about marriage? What do we believe about serving as a soldier? What do we believe about things? And in Christianity, it was thought that in order to have the right answers to that, you needed to base your answers on authority. Well, what authority is the best authority? The best authority would be Jesus and his followers. The people who heard Jesus teach. And so, they're dead. They've been dead for hundreds of years, okay? So what you want are books written by them, because that would record their authority. the church then debated which books go back to the apostles. They debated this for a long time, and as I was saying, there were different churches, different church people who wanted to be leaders had different opinions about all these things. But only one group ended up winning out, and it's the group that later called itself the Orthodox form of Christianity. The word orthodox means correct opinion or right belief. These people claimed they had the right belief. And they claimed, not only did they have the right belief, they claimed that their side had always been the majority view. Because what they said was what the apostles had said. And it's what all the early churches said. And every now and then some kind of a heretic would come along and mess things up. But basically this has always been the view. And that they rewrote the history of the engagement. And they're the ones who chose which books are going to be in. People who won those arguments. I personally, I have no qualms with their choice. I mean, I have some qualms with their choice, but I mean, but basically, these are really important and precious books that we have. And we're really glad we have them. What we wish is that we had more of the others. They get discovered on occasion, but we'd like to see what did other faithful Christians think. That would be worth knowing. But we don't know because these other books weren't copied or weren't preserved or even were destroyed. Does that answer your question? I mean, you can't really... Okay, I'll give you a name. If you want a name, I'll give you a name. The first author we have who made a list of our 27 books and said, these are the 27 books. There aren't any other. There are no more. There are no less. These 27 was a church father named Athanasius. Athanasius was a 4th century church father who wrote a letter in the year 367 to his churches in which he told them, these are the 27 books. We have that letter. This is the first time anybody of record listed our 27 books. So if the books were written in the 1st century, this is 300 years later. It's 300 years before we get this collection. And even then, the matter wasn't decided. There continued to be debates after that. But basically, there never was a church council that decided it. The Council of Nicaea did not... Everybody says that the Council of Nicaea chose the books of the Bible. It's completely wrong. The Council of Nicaea didn't even talk about it. It was later, and there never was a church council that ratified this until the 16th century. And so it really was just a matter of popular opinion. Let me say one final thing before I end. Now that most of the students have left, I'll give you the real story. When I do speaking gigs, I like to mention a blog that I do, so you might be aware of it. I have a blog that you can get on and read. I post about 1,000 words every day, 5 or 6 days a week. I post about 1,000 words, 5 or 6, on everything having to do with early Christianity. I deal with the historical Jesus, writings of Paul, formation of the New Testament, how we got the New Testament, books that didn't make it into the New Testament, the persecution of early Christians, the conversion of the Emperor Constantine. I mean, I talk about everything in early Christianity, and it's about 1,000 words a day, 5 or 6 days a week. The only deal is, to join the blog, you have to pay. I charge $24.95 for a year's subscription. I do this not to line my own pockets. I actually don't keep a dime. I use this blog as a way of raising money for charity. I give every penny to charities dealing with hunger and homelessness. This last year, on the blog, we raised $120,000. So it's some serious money, but it would be more money if you would join. So think about joining. Just go on the internet and just look for the Bart Ehrman blog, and you'll find it. And you get so much for your money. I've been doing it for 5 years. I think I have literally written almost 1.5 million words on the blog. So you get a lot for your money, and it all goes to a good cause. So think about it. Okay, I'll stop there. Pardon me?